He had nothing but a dream and a heartbeat that refused to give up. His name was Ethan, a boy from a small forgotten town where hope was treated like a crime. Every morning he walked through narrow dusty streets, carrying tools older than his age, fixing broken radios for people who never looked him in the eye. They called him useless, they said he was wasting his life on fantasies, but he never answered back. His silence was not weakness, it was the sound of a war being fought inside his heart. He wanted to build something that could make life easier for people who struggled every day. It wasn't about fame or money. It was about purpose. But purpose is a heavy thing to carry when the world is laughing at you. At night, when the town lights went dark, Ethan would light a single candle and sit beside his broken table. The wood was cracked, the tools rusted, but his eyes glowed with quiet fire. He would sketch designs on torn paper, his fingers blackened with ink and grease. Each line he drew felt like a small prayer. He didn't know how, but he believed that one day, one of those lines would change everything. Yet, belief doesn't feed the stomach. There were nights when he went to bed hungry, the sound of his mother coughing in the other room haunting his thoughts. Sometimes he'd hold her old photograph and whisper, "I'll make it, Mom. I promise." Then he'd stare out the window at the empty street and think about how the world never gives mercy to dreamers. But he kept going. Every failure, every insult became another brick in the wall of his determination. He worked through pain, through exhaustion, through the noise of doubt that echoed inside his mind. Fear came often, like a shadow behind his every step. What if I fail again? What if I'm not good enough? The question stabbed his confidence, but he had learned something powerful. Fear only controls you when you stop moving. So he moved. Slowly, painfully, but he moved. One night he sat outside his small house, watching stars hide behind thick clouds. The air was cold, the kind that bites your skin, but he didn't move. He just stared and whispered, "Why does it have to hurt this much to dream?" No answer came, only the sound of wind hitting the tin roof. But inside that silence, he felt something shift. Maybe pain wasn't punishment. Maybe it was preparation. From that night on, he stopped waiting for better days. He started creating them. He spent every hour he could afford on learning, studying, experimenting. His fingers became rough, his eyes tired, but his heart was alive. Sometimes the power would go out, and he'd work in darkness, guided only by memory. Other times, he'd fall asleep at his desk, waking up with pencil marks on his face and burns on his hands. People saw madness, but Ethan saw meaning. He believed that if you suffer for something with all your heart, that suffering becomes sacred. Teaches you who you are. Weeks passed, then months, and the world still gave him nothing. No praise, no money, no recognition. Just silence. But silence was his teacher now. He had learned to listen, to the sound of his own heartbeat, to the rhythm of his breath, to the tiny voice that said, "You're not done yet." One day, when he was working on a small motor, a child from the neighborhood came and watched him. The boy asked, "Why do you work so hard when no one helps you?" Ethan smiled faintly and said, "Because one day, someone will need what I build." The boy didn't understand, but he remembered those words. That was the thing about Ethan. His hope was contagious, even when he didn't try to show it. But deep down, he was still scared. Scared of being forgotten, of dying before his dream took shape. Sometimes he'd stare at his hands and wonder if his effort mattered at all. But then he'd remember the candlelight, the whisper of his mother's voice, and he'd begin again. His journey was lonely, but in that loneliness, he discovered his greatest power, resilience. He wasn't the strongest, or the smartest, but he could endure. And in a world that breaks most people, endurance is everything. Every night ended the same way, a dim light, a tired boy, and a dream too stubborn to die. And as the dawn slowly painted the sky, Ethan would whisper to himself, "Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but one day, this dream will open its eyes." He woke up the next morning with the same ache in his bones and the same dream in his heart. The candle beside his bed had melted into a pool of wax, and the pages of his notebook were covered in messy, smudged sketches from the night before. His eyes were swollen from exhaustion, but his purpose was louder than his tiredness. He washed his face with cold water, tied the same broken shoes he had been wearing for months, and stepped out into the dusty street. The world outside hadn't changed. The same people stood at the same corners, talking about the same meaningless things. Some glanced at him, whispered, and laughed like they always did. But Ethan didn't respond anymore. Their words had lost their power. They couldn't reach the place inside him that had already survived worse storms. He walked toward the repair shop where he worked, a small, forgotten place filled with broken machines and the smell of rust. His boss barely noticed him. To most people, Ethan was just another pair of rough hands that fixed things no one else cared about. But to Ethan, every screw he turned, every wire he soldered, was a lesson. He wasn't just repairing machines, he was repairing himself, his patience, his focus, his will. He studied silently, watching how things worked, learning from every mistake, storing each lesson deep in his mind like treasure. He wasn't chasing money anymore. He was chasing mastery. And yet, there were days when the weight of it all crushed him. Rejection after rejection, failure after failure, it was hard not to feel like the world was laughing at his hope. Once, he had saved enough to build a small device, one that could convert wasted heat into light. He believed in it with all his heart. When he showed it to a local businessman, the man listened for a few seconds, smiled faintly, and said, "You're a good kid, but dreams don't feed you. Get a real job." Those words hit him harder than he expected. Ethan walked home that night under a sky full of indifferent stars, feeling smaller than ever. His room was silent when he entered. The small device sat on the table, glowing faintly before dying again. It worked, but no one cared. He sat in the dark for hours, staring at it, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe dreams were just traps for people like him. People born in forgotten towns with no one to believe in them. The thought of giving up crept in like a slow, cold fog. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to live like everyone else, quietly, safely, without purpose. But then, the wind tapped gently on the window, like a memory knocking on his heart. And in that soft sound, he heard his father's voice again. "Great things are born from broken hands, Ethan. Don't stop just because it hurts." He closed his eyes, tears sliding down his cheeks. His voice broke as he whispered into the darkness. "I won't stop, Dad. Not yet." The next morning, he returned to his workbench with a strange calmness. His failures no longer scared him, they fueled him. He rebuilt his design from scratch, not for money, not for approval, but for himself. The nights grew longer, his eyes burned, his hands cracked and bled, but he didn't stop. Every spark that burned his fingers taught him something new about patience. Every explosion reminded him that progress always demands pain. The neighbors began to complain about the noise, the smell of smoke, the constant hammering. But Ethan just smiled faintly and said, "At least it's alive." His world had become a loop: work, failure, rebuild, repeat. He stopped counting the days, he only counted attempts. 10, 20, 50, 100. And then he stopped counting altogether. People came and went, friends disappeared, but his dreams stayed. Even when loneliness pressed against his chest, he'd whisper, "If this is the price for purpose, I'll pay it." One night, the universe tested him again. He was working on a new prototype when a fuse blew. Sparks shot into his notes, flames caught, and within moments his papers were burning. He panicked, tried to put out the fire with his bare hands, burning his skin, coughing through the smoke. When it was over, half of his work, years of effort, had turned to ashes. He sat there, numb, surrounded by the smell of smoke and failure. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. He didn't cry this time. He just stared at the blackened pages until dawn broke through the window. Then he picked up a piece of burnt paper, ran his fingers over it, and whispered with a faint smile, "Even ashes have stories." And once again, he began. Days turned into nights, nights into weeks. He devoured everything he could learn: engineering, circuits, thermodynamics, anything that could make him better. He read torn manuals, watched old tutorials on broken computers, practiced with scrap parts from the repair shop. his life became a rhythm of creation and destruction. And strangely, he began to love it. Every failure felt less like an enemy and more like a teacher guiding him toward the right path. Sometimes, when exhaustion tried to break him, he'd whisper to himself, "Pain is temporary. Progress is permanent." Those words became his prayer. And then, one evening, as the last golden light of sunset fell into his tiny room, Ethan connected 2 wires on his latest design. He waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a small flicker. A tiny hum. And finally, a soft glow. A small bulb lit up on the table. His heart froze. He stared at it, afraid to blink. Then, laughter burst out of him. Shaky, disbelieving laughter mixed with tears. "It works," he said, his voice trembling. "It actually works." He stood there, staring at that fragile, trembling light, the first true reflection of his endless nights. It flickered and went out seconds later, but that didn't matter. That one spark had changed everything. That small light proved that his belief wasn't madness, it was truth. He fell to his knees, laughing and crying all at once. "I told you, Mom," he whispered through the tears. "I told you it would work." That night, he didn't sleep. He just sat there, watching the dead bulb, smiling through his exhaustion. The world still didn't know his name, but it didn't matter anymore. Because in that quiet room, surrounded by ashes, tools and memories, Ethan had finally found what he'd been searching for all along. Not success, not recognition, but proof. Proof that his dream was real. Proof that hope, no matter how small, could light up even the darkest room. He picked up his burnt notebook, drew a new version of his design, and underlined one sentence at the bottom of the page. "I will not stop until this light stays on forever." Ethan didn't sleep that night, and when morning came, his eyes were red, but his spirit was alive in a way it had never been before. He walked through the city with a quiet kind of fire in his chest. No one else could see it, but he could feel it, burning, whispering, reminding him that even the smallest spark can change a life. The world around him still looked the same: gray streets, tired faces, empty noise. But inside him, something had shifted. Every sound, every step, every heartbeat now carried purpose. He went back to the workshop, sat in front of his half-broken invention, and smiled. "You and I," he whispered to the machine, "we're not done yet." He started working again, slower this time, calmer, as if the universe was finally listening. His hands trembled, but not from fear, from the weight of hope. Days turned into weeks, and people began to notice. The same neighbors who used to laugh at his obsession now watched him differently. They didn't understand, but they felt something in the air around him, a strange, silent intensity that made them pause. Even his boss, who had once told him to stop wasting time on dreams, stood behind him one evening and said softly, "You really think this thing will work?" Ethan didn't look up. "I don't think," he replied. "I know." There was no arrogance in his voice, just quiet belief. That was the moment his fear finally broke. But the path wasn't smooth. Every small victory came with pain. Some nights, his body couldn't take it anymore. His hands shook, his vision blurred, and his heart ached from exhaustion. He would sit on the floor, surrounded by broken parts, and question everything. "Why am I doing this? Who even cares?" The silence never answered, but somehow, deep inside, his soul did. "Because you promised yourself," it whispered. "Because you're not done yet." And then he would stand up again. That was his rhythm now. Break, fall, rise, repeat. One stormy night, lightning flashed through the sky as rain pounded against his window. The power went out across the neighborhood, plunging everything into darkness. Ethan sat there, staring at his invention, now the only source of potential light in the room. His heart raced. He took a deep breath, grabbed a candle for a bit of guidance, and connected the last wire he had been saving for days. The storm roared louder, but inside that small room, time seemed to stop. He turned a small switch, and the machine came alive. Sparks danced, metal hissed, and for a moment, he thought it would explode. But then, it happened. A soft glow emerged, steady and strong. The bulb didn't flicker this time. It stayed on. Ethan stared at it, his mouth open, his eyes wide, tears gathering faster than he could blink. The light reflected in his eyes, trembling with the rain outside. "It's alive," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's really alive." The machine hummed quietly, warm and golden. For the first time in years, his room wasn't filled with smoke, it was filled with light. He sank to his knees, laughing and crying all at once, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Every scar, every burn, every lonely night, it had all led to this single moment. He whispered his father's words again, trembling, "Great things are born from broken hands." He looked up at the glowing bulb and felt something sacred. It wasn't just electricity, it was faith made visible. He thought of his mother, his late nights, his failures, and every person who told him to quit. "This," he whispered, "is for all the times I was told I couldn't." The rain outside slowed to a gentle drizzle, and silence filled the room. For once, it wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was peace. The next morning, he carried his small invention to the rooftop of his building. The city below him was still asleep. The sun was rising, painting the horizon in shades of orange and gold. Ethan placed his device on the ledge, connected it to a small power cell, and turned it on. The light shone bright, even brighter than before. It caught the morning mist and turned it into something magical. He smiled, feeling the warmth on his face. "We made it," he whispered. "We really made it." But his journey didn't end there. That light became the beginning of something greater. People started to ask questions, to listen, to believe. A local paper wrote about the boy who built light from nothing. Engineers came to see his design. Offers began to appear. For the first time, Ethan wasn't invisible anymore. Yet, despite the sudden attention, he stayed humble. When someone asked him how he did it, he simply said, "By failing more times than I can count." That night, after everyone left, he stood in his small room again, the same room where his dream was born. He stared at the machine glowing softly in the dark and thought about the boy he used to be. The one who cried alone, the one who almost gave up, the one who still believed even when no one else did. He whispered, "You did it, Ethan. You turned pain into power." He sat by the window, looking out at the lights of the city. It felt like every light out there was whispering back to him, "You're not alone anymore." He smiled faintly, resting his tired head against the glass. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of the dark. Because now he knew, he could create his own light. And that light, no matter how small, would never die again. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the rain return, this time soft and gentle, like applause from the universe itself. His hands were still scarred, his journey still unfinished, but his heart was finally free. He didn't need the world's approval anymore. He had found what he was looking for all along. Not success, not fame, but peace. And as he whispered to the quiet night, "I am the light," the bulb beside him glowed one last time, steady and strong, painting the whole room in gold. It wasn't just a machine anymore, it was a piece of his soul, burning bright against everything that ever tried to dim it. The morning light spilled through the cracked window, painting Ethan's worn-out room in shades of gold and dust. He hadn't slept. The invention sat silently on the table, glowing faintly, as if it knew what was coming. Today was the day he would show it to the world. His heart was calm but heavy, filled with the weight of years of struggle, rejection, and hope. He put on the same jacket he wore on the day he was first laughed at. It was torn near the pocket, the color faded, but it carried memories of everything he had survived. As he walked through the city streets, people turned to look at him, some recognizing the quiet boy who once fixed broken radios for coins. He didn't look back. Every step echoed the rhythm of his journey, slow, steady, unbreakable. He reached the exhibition hall early, the grand doors standing tall like the walls of fate. Inside, inventors and investors moved about with polished shoes and confident smiles. Ethan felt out of place, his hands trembling as he held his machine, a small device, unpolished, handmade, and imperfect. Yet, in its imperfection, it carried his soul. He found his booth, placed it gently on the table, and looked around. No one paid attention. People walked past him without stopping, just like before. For a moment, the same old feeling returned, that sting of invisibility. But this time, he didn't lower his head. He whispered to himself, "They ignored me once, they'll watch me today." Hours passed. One by one, judges moved from project to project, giving polite smiles, asking formal questions. When they reached Ethan's booth, one of them said, "You're not on the list." Ethan replied quietly, "I didn't come to be listed. I came to be seen." They exchanged glances, curious but unconvinced. Ethan pressed a small switch. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the machine came alive, humming softly, producing a gentle continuous light. It drew energy from nothing but the movement of air and heat around it. The judges leaned closer. One of them whispered, "This shouldn't be possible." Ethan smiled faintly. "Neither should hope, but it exists." The hall fell silent as the small glow illuminated his table. It wasn't bright or grand, but it was real. And in that moment, reality was enough. Reporters rushed in, cameras flashing, people asking questions all at once. Someone shouted, "How did you make this?" Ethan took a deep breath. "By refusing to stop," he said. "Every failure taught me how to make it right." His voice didn't shake this time. It was steady, grounded, full of quiet power. The crowd began to applaud. Not the loud, meaningless clapping of formality, but genuine applause. The kind that carries emotion. The kind that says, "We see you now." A few rows back, Ethan saw familiar faces, people who once told him to quit. His old boss stood there, his expression unreadable. Ethan didn't feel anger. Instead, he felt peace. Because this moment wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving himself right. When the applause died down, he looked at the crowd and said softly, "I'm not special. I just didn't stop. The world told me I couldn't, but I learned that every no is just another step toward your yes." His words sank into the air like quiet thunder. That night, his invention made headlines. The boy who brought light from nothing. People wrote about him, companies called him, investors offered deals. But Ethan didn't chase fame. He went back to his small room, the same one where it all began. The same table, the same window, the same silence. He placed the machine on the table again and just stared at it. The light flickered gently, filling the room with warmth. He sat there, remembering every night he cried, every time he wanted to give up, every insult that once broke his heart. Now, they all felt like blessings. Because without them, he wouldn't be here. He picked up his old notebook, pages burned, torn, full of failed sketches, and smiled. "You were my first invention," he said softly. "You held my dreams before anyone else did." He closed it carefully and placed it beside the machine. Then, he stood near the window, watching the city lights below. They looked different now. Maybe they were always this bright, but tonight, they felt like stars bowing to him. He whispered, "I was once afraid of the dark, but now I know darkness was never my enemy. It was my teacher." The next morning, a letter arrived. It was from an international innovation foundation inviting him to present his invention on a global stage. He held the letter for a long time, smiling quietly. Not because it meant success, but because it meant his voice had finally reached beyond walls. That evening, as the sun set, Ethan went to the same hill he used to sit on as a boy, the one where he first dreamed of changing the world. He placed his machine on the ground beside him, watching the light dance against the twilight. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I did it, Dad. I finally did it." The wind blew softly through the grass, carrying his words away, maybe to the heavens. Tears filled his eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of pain, they were gratitude. Gratitude for the struggle, the loneliness, the fear, because all of it had led him here. As the night fell, he turned his machine off and looked up at the stars. "You laughed when I started," he said with a gentle smile. But you're not laughing anymore. He picked up his device, placed it close to his heart, and walked down the hill slowly, his shadow stretching long behind him. The camera would fade out there, showing only his silhouette walking into the golden horizon, the world glowing softly around him. And as his voice echoed one last time, "Calm, strong, eternal," it said, "Dreams don't come true when the world believes in you. They come true when you believe in yourself. Even when the world doesn't."